Hello and welcome to the Jordan Powers Experience. My name is Jordan Powers, and on today's episode, I am joined by the one, the only Eric Cytrynbaum. Eric is an expert in his field. He is the Associate Professor of Mathematics at the University of British Columbia, and he works with a group called the BC COVID-19 Modeling Group. The BC COVID-19 Modeling Group works on rapid response modeling of the COVID-19 pandemic with a special focus on British Columbia and Canada. This interdisciplinary group, working independently from the government, includes experts in epidemiology, mathematics, and data analysis from UBCO, SFU, UVic, and the private sector, with support from the Pacific Institute for the Mathematical Sciences. So I am way out of my depth here when I'm chatting with Eric, but he was kind enough to hop on a Zoom call with me and have it recorded. And I think, there's going to be some information in here that's hard for people to fully grasp, including myself, and some information that probably a lot of us need to hear. I'm somebody who's been quite outspoken online, probably too much for my own good, and I'm gonna have to really reconsider a lot of my thoughts and opinions after chatting with him, and so I'm looking forward to re-listening to this whole episode. So yeah, without further ado, here's my conversation with Eric Cytrynbaum. 2, 1. Eric Cytrynbaum. Is that correct?
Yeah, you got it.
Sweet. I was telling you off camera, I get anxiety every time I have to pronounce people's names, so I hope I got it right.
I get the same problem. I teach a lot of students and a lot of names that I'm not familiar with. I'm used to it now, but
I bet. Well, thank you for coming on the Jordan Powers Experience and chatting with me. You are an expert in your field, from as far as I can tell. I was looking at your bio, and when I was trying to read some of it, I was like, man, I don't even know what half these words mean. So
yeah. Well, confusing people is always a good way to come across as an expert.
that's honestly a problem we're facing too often in today's climate. So maybe you can provide the people some background on who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a professor in the math department at UBC. So my job involves both research and teaching and service, which is the third. Everybody sort of forgets to mention that. But actually, a lot of what I am now focused on, or at least what maybe you heard of me through. Actually, one of the things I'm doing is sort of service. It's just volunteer work that all of us in our group have been doing. My research is not in COVID in epidemiology. I teach a course where it comes up. We spend a couple of weeks talking about epidemiology models. But my research is actually mostly in applying mathematics and using mathematics to understand mechanisms in cell and developmental biology. But a colleague of mine who does work, actually two colleagues, one at Simon Fraser and one at UBC, who both work in epidemiology modeling, invited me to join a group of academics about almost 2 years ago, March 2020. And the purpose of putting together the group was they had some connections with the BC CDC, and the BC CDC wanted to have additional brains that they could, kind of offload questions or, consult. And so there's actually over 100 people on the channel, but now we're really down to a core group of about 10 or 15 people. A few of them are actively doing modeling. I'm not doing modeling on COVID myself, but I've recently, in the last, since April 2021, I've been the guy in charge of taking the reports that we're now producing every 2 or 3 weeks and producing a video I posted on YouTube. And the goal of those videos is to explain some of the results that we're getting. The main audience at the beginning was journalists who were asking for interviews and finding out what we thought about different things that were going on. So that's the primary audience. But, obviously we've got a few more than that. There's a few hundred to a few thousand people watching the videos now on a regular basis. And I think those are generally more technically minded people who can sort of tolerate the more, data, math, sort of language and jargon and stuff. It's not really, they're not really ideal for a lay audience, but it's what we do and how we do it. So that's our kind of our pitch, I guess. And our hope is that either, maybe people in the ministry or the BC CDC read the reports or watch the videos, and it influences their decision-making if we can say anything that's new or, of interest that they hadn't considered already, but also a major public education component to it.
Nice. And all those videos and stuff, they can be found on a YouTube channel. Is that the BC COVID-19 modeling group? Is that the channel?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, Google will pull that up for you if you just search for it, but I can give you, if you want, I can give you the links so you can include it in the description.
Yeah, we'll put that in the description. And so, how has this kind of whole past 2 years and dealing with all this data and putting out information publicly and stuff, how has it kind of been for you following the whole political and public dialogue that's been happening with so many different opinions and a wide range of people like myself just yelling online all the time?
Yeah. I try and stay out of the yelling as much as I can. I think there's a lot of opinions on both sides that are sort of driven by emotional responses. I think humans are driven by emotional responses. I might pretend that I'm driven just by data, but that's but I like to think that the data and the analysis of the data informs my decision making, even though it sort of comes through the emotional responses I have to the data. So I'm on Twitter, which is not a great idea, I think, for most humans. And there's a lot of stuff there that I don't know. I try and let it just roll off. And I get some tweet responses and some occasional messages that are, I wouldn't say I've never had anything rude. Some of my colleagues have gotten some, I would say, genuine hate mail over some of our results, which is really, I don't really get it, because, there's not a lot that we do that you can't really redo yourself if you know enough to do it. And so getting upset when we make projections and then telling us we messed up and didn't get our projections right, when that's really rarely the case, it doesn't really upset me, but it's just a little bit surprising.
Totally.
But I think it's a technical problem and people aren't used to dealing with that. So,
totally. Well, yeah, somebody like myself, again, I pretty much had a hard time paying attention in math class starting grade 11 or 12. So I try personally not to have the conversation where I debate any of the experts, because at the end of the day, I am not one of them. I try to hold the conversation around the way the BC government is moving and some of the rules and regulations that they put in place, or these mandates. And I think that's probably where a lot of the emotional response comes from people, is like, we've never had, it's an unprecedented time, and we haven't had so much involvement from our local government like we have right now. And so it's just a little difficult for people to digest, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So I think everybody's critical of the government, which I think that's the role of the government.
Yeah.
Kind of to get beaten up. I think a good measure of whether the government's doing a good job is whether the bitching and complaining is roughly equal from sort of both sides, or any two sides of any issue.
Right.
And I don't know if that's the case. I don't know how to measure that. I'd want data before I make any conclusions, given what you know about me already. But I think the problem with what's going on right now is that the noise, or the volume from both sides, is just sky high, right? There's just so much on the line in everybody's mind over this. You've got some people who are, I'm going to give it the polar opposite perspective, right? So some people on this side, as described by these guys, they're all paranoid, right? Like the government's out to get them. And then the other way, they're terrified. They're overly fearful, and it's not that big a deal, right? So you're either overly anxious or overly paranoid.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's that's what we're sitting in the middle of.
When you're doing all this modeling and gathering all this data, have you noticed any clear kind of difference in the spread of this virus based off of the some of the mandates and some of the rules that the government has been putting in place, such as like a vaccine passport?
Oh yeah, oh for sure. Yeah, so I think people might misunderstand the trajectory. I've heard people say that, you know, the number of cases goes up and it goes down, and there's no rhyme or reason to it, and it's not about the measures. When you start looking at a good model, like we have a couple models that are coming out of our group, you really can see exactly what's influencing, not in the details. So I can't tell you what percentage of the turnaround is due to people putting on masks or due to the vaccine mandate specifically. But for so let's see, in March 2020, we had a very small wave at that time, but we didn't know it was going to be small. And we had to, you know, hold off long enough to be able to prepare for whatever we thought was coming. And so you see a very, you know, if you look at the data at the scale of Omicron, there's just a little, you know, uptick, and we lock down and you see it go back down again. And then it was quiet, and then we reopened, and then you start seeing climbing in June, and then there were some measures put in place and turn around. And everyone again in December, January, 2021, and then again with Alpha in April, and then again with Delta in August. And now we can't see it because the data is not very good anymore because we've just maxed out our testing capacity. But if we had it, I'm fairly confident that we would see the effect of December 21st. I don't think December 21st's measure and any that have been put in place since have turned us from increasing to actually, you know, coming back down, but it'll have, you know, tempered the rate at which we're going up. Right. So those transitions are really clear in the data. And if you write down a model, so Dean Carlin's model, he has arbitrary breakpoints that, you know, he has things happening for a while in a model, and then the data dictate whether he should put in a breakpoint or not. And what I mean by a breakpoint is at that point, you know, the model will say, okay, now we need a new transition rate because the data is no longer fitting well. And it'll hone in on exactly what date that thing should be placed. He doesn't prescribe it, but he says, okay, and how much of a change in the transmission rate should we make? And the model automatically, by fitting to the data, it automatically identifies where to put these and how big to make the change. And his data, his fit just really fits the data very consistently. And it's very clear that whatever happened, his dates come out to be right close to when the measures are put in place.
Interesting.
And the extent of the turnaround is, you know, enough to make it fit the data. And that can tell us what the whole collection of measures that were put in place on that day did for the overall growth rate of the case counts.
Right.
So it's very clear. Like, I mean, I can look with you at the data trace and tell you exactly what the change was on which day in, like, right, as far as the data predicts or, you know, fits for us or predicts for us. And it's very hard to argue that there's anything random or missing. What's a little bit tricky is to ascribe particular influences, like masking did 20% of it and the vaccine passport did 30% of it. That's more tricky.
Right, of course. Yeah. What's so interesting about this time is this, like, almost like collective kind of psychology that people are going through, where it doesn't almost matter to your average person how much data in the world they're exposed to. Mm-hmm. What they see with their own two eyes is what really, really drives home their opinions and their beliefs. Like, you see the restaurants get shut down, and around like St. Paddy's Day, for example, they have to close at 10. And then I see a bunch of my friends on Instagram just go to a giant house party because they can't go to a bar, you know? And so it's like those kind of rules and that I question, and then I wonder, like, is this actually even necessary to be doing? But it seems like, based off the data, there is a lot of support for some of the measures that they're taking.
Yeah. I mean, I think the anecdote of a bunch of friends giving up on the restaurant or the bar and going to a house party is notable, but it's not necessarily common, right? Like just how many people left the bar and went home and how many went to a house party. And you probably find that, well, if things didn't turn around, then you could probably guess that everybody went to the house party. But when you see these measures really having a strong influence, which we have very consistently, and again, when I say these measures, I mean as a collective, because it's a little tricky to piece out exactly which ones. But they do seem to be having an effect at least at the broad scale where the data that we've looked at. And when I say the broad scale, I mean like health authority level. So all of Vancouver Coastal or all of Fraser, like we could see the turnarounds in each of those data sets. In your neighborhood specifically of like 7,000 people, I can't say exactly, right? Because maybe everybody in your neighborhood is going to that house party, but
yeah, it's anecdotal, but I'd say Kelowna is we like our beer and we like our wine, so people like to party out here, that's for sure.
Yeah, I have a secret for you. It's everywhere.
yeah.
There's a party here in Vancouver too.
So yeah, I mean, I guess it's a good point, and almost goes without saying, but I'm sure you saw within the models you were doing, vaccines, once they started rolling out, there was probably a clear indication that they were doing the job.
Yeah, that's clear. Even with Omicron, although you'll hear a lot of people say like, oh, vaccines, Omicron avoids them. That statement is a matter of percentage, right? So it avoids the vaccine. Like people who are vaccinated are more likely to get Omicron than they were to get Delta, but somebody who's vaccinated is still less likely to get Omicron than somebody who's unvaccinated. And that's especially true with the boosters. If you're 6 months or more past your vaccination, your second vaccination, then you're not wildly different from somebody who's unvaccinated in terms of your chance of getting infected. But after the booster, it's really right back. Well, not quite back up to where it was for Delta with two doses, but it's pretty strong. Yeah.
I wish I would have chatted with you before I went and did this interview with CBC. I did it yesterday, and it hasn't come out yet, so hopefully I didn't make a fool of myself. But they were asking people who were hesitant of getting the booster, like some of the reasons as to why they might be hesitant. And they couldn't find anybody to talk to, so they came across me. And I had expressed that when I got the first 2 doses, it was because I didn't want to spread this to my grandparents who might be at a higher risk of ending up in the hospital or getting some severe illness, or one of my friends who's going through brain cancer treatments right now. Yeah. I didn't want to put them at risk, and my hesitancy didn't outweigh the potential risk I could put them in. But now looking at this Omicron situation, yet again, with my own 2 eyes, I feel like it seems like it's spreading no matter what. And to me, it feels like the booster might not even change that, but I guess you would say differently.
Yeah. So there's 2 different things that you would hope for out of a vaccine. One is to protect you from getting infected, and one is to protect you from getting severe illness. And people say Omicron is milder, and that is correct. But Omicron spreads so much more rapidly that way more people will be sick than would have been otherwise in a tight period of time. And what that means is that smaller fraction of people who are going to end up at the hospital, there's just way more of them because of how quickly it transmits. So the hospitalization issue is still a risk for the individual, even though it's less so. It's lower chance of you ending up in the hospital, for example. But it's a way bigger problem for society in general. So your friend who's dealing with cancer treatment, there's 2 risks that you pose to that person. One is if you're sick and you hang out with them, or you hang out with somebody who hangs out with them, you can get them infected, and they are much more vulnerable to this. But the other effect, which I think people neglect, and I think it's significant, and it hasn't been quantified, and I got an email from a journalist yesterday about quantifying this, if she can find data on this, and that is the hospitals and the medical field in general is getting slammed right now. Like it's been steady all along, like for months now. If you talk to anybody, even a gynecologist friend who delivers babies, she says she sees way more cases, not because COVID is a problem, but because she works at Women's, and people from all the way up the Fraser Valley are putting pressure on the hospitals because of COVID. And so women who are delivering they'll more likely come to women's because, so it's this cascade of things that happen. And anybody who's getting cancer treatment, like if it could be put off by 3 weeks, they might get put off by 3 weeks, and that could have an influence. Once they're already under treatment, maybe that's not as big a deal, but diagnosis is going to be an issue. And there's all sorts of things that just because of the sheer number of people who are needing hospital treatment from COVID, it's going to complicate a whole bunch of other issues.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of cascading problems that are at a society or population level that the individual never sees, right? And the other big thing is your chance of going to the hospital has always been small in a sense.
Right.
With Delta, if you got sick with it, somebody your age, maybe there's a 1 in 40 chance that you'd be hospitalized because of it, which is, I mean, you could say that's pretty small, but there's still, like in my kids' class, they're 9 years old. So in their whole class, in their whole grade, or in their whole school, rather, there's about 250 or something students. So if all of them got COVID, maybe one of them would end up in the hospital. That's a kid in the hospital, right? Across the whole society, when you have 400,000 kids in that under 10 group, that's a huge number, and we don't have the capacity for it. So there's a bunch of very hard to sort of absorb, because there's this probability barrier for us, and anecdotal doesn't do probability well.
Right. Yeah. What would you say to somebody who maybe like myself, 26, healthy, by their standard definition or their own personal definition, handful of vitamins every morning, works out 4 or 5 times a week. And they say, like, I'm healthy, I don't need to get my booster, and I'm worried that there's going to be more coming down the line, and I'm just going to have to keep getting an injection every 6 months. What would be your kind of argument to them?
Until I was 42, I think, I never thought twice about a flu vaccine.
Right.
And the flu vaccine is not as effective. It's more of a crapshoot because they don't know what strain is coming through and whatever. And then I had kids, and one of them has a condition that they recommended that the whole family get a flu vaccine. So, I looked into it, what's the risk? What are the complications? And we have a higher risk in our house. I get it every year. I don't think about it. Vaccines these vaccines are even safer. Like, it's surprising to see how much misinformation there is about the risk of these vaccines. I've seen a lot about it, and none of it has been convincing in the data. And I think fundamentally, the only reason that somebody could convincingly tell me that they shouldn't get a vaccine is because they don't understand the data. Like, that's what it comes down to, or they haven't looked at it, right? They may not have looked at it, but there's a few things. Somebody in your age category is at higher risk than older, for example, with the vaccine. So with the mRNA vaccines like Pfizer or Moderna, you've probably heard about myocarditis, right? I
have a very close friend who developed myocarditis right after his first dose.
Right. So yeah, that's a risk, but if you look at the data, the risk of getting myocarditis after a vaccination is about 1/10 what it is of getting myocarditis from having COVID. Right. So yeah, you're volunteering to put yourself at risk for the sake of reducing your probability of getting COVID. So what that means is, if you think your chances of getting COVID in the whole pandemic is 1/10 of, like, they're 1 in 10, right? Like, if you think it's a 1 in 10 chance, then yeah, maybe it makes sense not to get vaccinated, because that means that your risk from COVID-induced myocarditis is lower than vaccination-induced myocarditis. But more than 1/10 of the population has already had COVID. Right. There's no way that number is in favor of not getting vaccinated. So, like, that one's crossed off the list, right? Like, that's the way I think about it. And other people, they have a very different view. They think, I'm choosing to get the vaccine, and that puts me at risk, but I have this illusion that I'm not at risk for getting COVID.
Right.
I can avoid it. I can duck somehow. Like,
I got enough crystals in my room that there's no way it's coming in here.
Yeah, if we have to have that conversation, I leave you to your own, right?
Yeah, very fair.
I can't convince you with data.
What's your kind of general thoughts on this Omicron variant as it's being spread so rapidly and stuff? And what kind of general thoughts do you have about it based off the data you're seeing?
It's fast. It's moving very fast. It's moving faster than we can. I mean, most things that we've thought and said before about Alpha and Delta and doing things, we're behind the ball, right? Like it's really too late. Like by now, even if we wanted to try and derail it, it would be extremely difficult. One of the model sort of trials that Dean did was boosted everybody this week and see what impact does it have. And even that wouldn't really be enough to have a strong impact, especially if you take time to do all that boostering.
Right.
And so basically what it looks like now, and just to give you a sense of scale, roughly speaking, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, the vast majority of the population that is susceptible, which is millions of people, will catch COVID. And what that means is that risk to your health, whatever it's been over the last 2 years, in those 2 years, about 250,000 people in BC have got COVID. So think about 250,000 people walking around society spread out over 2 years. And now in the next 3 weeks, we're going to have, right now, we probably have, maybe it's close to 1 million people are infected right now. And so they're all doing that right now, right? So when you go out, all that risk from the last 2 years of COVID is now packed and greater, 4 times greater if it's 1 million currently, but that number is probably going to rise for another week or so. And that's all packed into the next couple of weeks. Okay, Omicron is a little bit milder. So it's still, the risk from the entire pandemic is now packed into the next 2 weeks, roughly.
Right.
Like that's a very hand wavy argument.
Well, I saw one of your tweets as well. I'm just trying to pull it up here. Where you were saying, you put in quotation marks, mild, but you were kind of explaining the exponential strain that it starts to have on the hospital system. I'll put the tweet up on the screen here. Do you know the tweet I'm referring to? Or
I think so, yeah. So I put mild in quotes because it really should be milder.
Right. I'm not mild. Yeah. So exponential is 101. Until now, 4% of cases end up in hospitals. Suppose Omicron has the same severity and with a doubling time of 3 days, hospital capacities is hit in 30 days. Now suppose it's half as severe, 33 days, a quarter as severe, 36 days. Mild doesn't buy us much time.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, that's people tend not to really get exponential growth because exponential growth doesn't usually go for long. But in our population with millions, it doesn't take much time before you get a huge number of cases. And the point is that if you have exponential growth and you're doubling that rapidly, this week there are 250,000 cases, new cases, then in 4 days, there's going to be another 500,000 new cases. And that just keeps on going every 4 days, roughly 4 days. We don't know exactly what that doubling time is because the data is hard to decipher now. But with that kind of a doubling time, what milder basically means, instead of 3 out of 100 people who are infected going to the hospital, it's now 1 out of 100. Or even if it's 1/3 out of 100, right? If it's 10 times smaller, if you take exponential growth and squash it down by 1/10, it's still exponential growth. And as long as there are enough susceptible people out there for that exponential growth to keep going for another 4 days or another 6 days, or 8 days, you're going to double. And to double enough to overcome 1/10, that's 3 doubling times. That's 12 days. So in 2 weeks, the benefit of 1/10 as severe is gone, right?
Yeah, geez. That makes a lot of sense. So with this variant being so just spreading so rapidly and stuff, are there any treatments that you're aware of that are helping people in the hospital once they've already caught this? Have there been any developments on that side of things that there's like a light at the end of the tunnel?
I mean, if you're in intensive care in the hospital, it's not clear to me we're talking about lights at the end of the tunnel, right? But I don't yet know, and it takes a while for the death rate to be clear out of this. There's some indication that, deaths are already better with Omicron. It's not my expertise, but Pfizer had a new drug. For people who are already sick, not vaccination, right? They do things.
Of course.
And there was another one, I can't remember what it was, but there's not a long list. Right.
Yeah. I mean, obviously Joe Rogan's very popular in the media right now, and he's talking about like monoclonal antibodies, ivermectin, that kind of stuff. I'm in no position to say whether or not that's working, but I hope that there's got to be something out there that can help us with the treatment side of things.
Yeah. So monoclonal antibodies, those seem to work, but I'll get back to it in a second. There's an interesting story to think about there. As using these type of treatments as a solution. The ivermectin, I don't know if I want to wade into it, but my opinion on it is very clear. And I think the data is very clear. The politics are very murky, right? Like, yeah, it's a horse dewormer I mentioned that just because I have to, right? Like, of course, but it's also used for humans. But the point is that there was some indication early on from one study that it might be doing something. And if you read the paper, it says it might be doing something. And that got like, whew, this is great. And then follow-up studies, it was clear that if it's doing something, it has to be at concentrations that are toxic to humans. And so maybe anecdotally, you hear people say, oh yeah, it worked. But, I've got a cold remedy that'll work in 9 days for you, right? So who knows? If there's no study that gives me data on that, then I'm not really that excited about anecdotal reports on it. I mean, for you, I am. Like, if it helps you and you're better,
sure, yeah,
great. But to start selling it en masse to hospitals just because my brother-in-law's friend who he plays pool with has a buddy who, it's not the way I'd want to operate. So the monoclonal antibody, or any treatment really, but the monoclonal antibody. So Omicron, the origin of Omicron, I don't know if you've heard much about this, but it's thought to have evolved in a single immunocompromised individual. They don't know who the person is, but there are all sorts of hallmarks in the genome of this variant that say that somebody was infected with this, maybe in hospital for a long time, months and months, possibly as much as a year, because there's no evidence of the types of mutations that are in Omicron sort of being broad in the population throughout that time. And one of the things that can induce the ability to avoid, so monoclonal antibodies, if the virus can avoid those monoclonal antibodies while you're being intensively treated with them by just random mutations that, stop allowing the antibody to bind to the virus's important parts for getting into your cells, then that's going to affect any antibody that attacks the virus. So if you rely on it, it's just like antibiotic resistance. If you rely on a treatment as your solution to a problem, the viruses are very quick to evolve compared to humans, and they will eventually find ways of avoiding that antibody, which means that if that antibody is similar or using a similar part of the virus to attack, that your body does after you've been vaccinated or after you've had it already once and now you've got a new strain of it, then it can sort of nullify the benefits of those antibodies because it's changed because it's been so intensively exposed to this monoclonal antibody treatment. Right. So I would say, I'm not saying we shouldn't use the monoclonal antibodies, but you have to really think carefully about what you're doing long-term, because when Alpha and Delta were around, everybody was like, let's get this down however we can. And maybe that means treating it intensively with things that will increase the chance of other variants arising, very smart variants arising. So that's definitely something that we have to keep in mind. But the problem is it's a long-term, right? Like when you have a wave right in front of you, you do what you can. Right. But it may not be in your best interest long-term.
Okay, interesting. I'm gonna have to re-listen to all that to really fully understand it. I appreciate you explaining it. What's your experience been like working with the BC government and stuff throughout this whole kind of pandemic and working with the public health authorities?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't work with them, actually.
Okay.
We're independent. There are a couple of people in our group who have very regular ties historically, right? Like somebody in our group does a lot of modeling. Dan Coombs does a lot of modeling with, he's got some papers on the opioid crisis and things like that, and they've worked together. And so he has connections, and other colleagues as well. Carolyn Colline has some strong connections, but that hasn't really been the main focus of what's going on and how we're communicating our results in the group. So before we started making those reports last April, we would, send things to the BC CDC through connections that people in the group had. And it's never really been clear to us what, it's sort of been a one-way, here's what we're finding. And maybe it makes its way into decision-making, but we have no clear indication that it does. And that's fine, right? I mean, we're trying to do science using the data. And the politicians, I don't know if the BC CDC is really injecting sort of a social, economic, political component to it, but maybe they are. And then certainly, Minister of Health and Dr. Bonnie Henry has to have these considerations in mind. We don't, right? I don't have to think about, restaurants going bankrupt when I'm telling you this is what we think is going to happen if we stay in the current sort of regime. That's what we think of as our role. We do have a couple of people in the group who have thought about the overall cost of the pandemic, economic included. But that's a lot harder modeling problem to work on. So we haven't done a lot on that.
Okay. Wow. Well, thanks, Eric. This has been great. I know you're a very busy man right now. I was getting your emails at like 1:30 a.m. in the morning, so I was like, this guy is hustling right now. So, I really, really appreciate your time. Is there anything that you kind of like to say? Final words? Maybe plug some links or anywhere that people can find your work. I don't know if it's for everyone, but I encourage you to check out our videos. We have some that might be really ready for a broad audience. So I can give you the links and put them in descriptions below the YouTube or below your in your podcast description or whatever. And I would really strongly encourage people to, you hear the expression, do your own research. And so actually so just a final comment on that. I think the biggest problem I've seen with the idea of doing your own research is who you're trusting. And I think we have authorities and we have experts, and we like to hope that our authorities are experts. But a problem like this one is a pretty broad problem, and the authorities may not have full expertise. They may also have influences that are, multifaceted and whatever. But I think it's important that people who don't understand this stuff themselves trust experts, at least, if not authorities. And I think the problem is that there's been a conflation of those, and people don't trust what we're doing because they perceive us as authorities, and they're not the same thing, right? I'd love for them to be the same thing. But and you'll see lots of different types of authorities, right? Joe Rogan has a very broad influence. He's not an expert. And if you see who he's talking to, he talks to specific experts. And it's not always the people who I would say are the right people to talk to about that particular issue. So I would encourage people to be critical thinkers on all authorities that they listen to and focus on evaluating the expertise of the person for the topic that they're talking about. Yeah, I get it. But my favorite saying for myself is, I have to tell myself this all the time: all I know for certain is that I know nothing, because I'm not an expert, right? So, I really appreciate your time, Eric. This has been great.
Yeah, it's been fun chatting with you.
Cool. Okay, well, I'm gonna stop the recording here, and I'll send this episode out to you as soon as it's done.
Okay, great.
When it's time right, you wanna be an actor, be the starter, you could be that. Wanna be the doctor, saving hearts, so we need that. And I could use some feedback. I know I'm not the best, but I'm really trying to be that. Spreading confidence.